Hello and welcome to Sevier Strategy, your automotive podcast. My name is John Sevier, and today I'm joined by a really good friend of mine and who I consider an automotive expert, Steve Laureys. How are you today, Steven?
Doing great, John. How about yourself?
Doing good. Real quick, before I go into anything, I want to just thank you for coming out today. Steve drove all the way in to come in here and talk with me today in our small little podcast studio, and it's always good to see you. So thank you for that, Stephen.
No worries at all. Thank you for having us out here.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who might not know you or might not have had the chance to see you speak before at one of the conventions or one of the sessions that you've done, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I started in the automotive space in 1994. And since then, I have sat every seat in the front of the house, right? So been the sales guy, been the sales manager, general manager, and really just stayed that course until about 8 years ago when I got an opportunity to get into the digital marketing side of it as an e-commerce director for a 13-store group. And then moved from there to the Gurley Leap Auto Group, which was 23 stores in 3 states for taking care of their digital marketing, some of their sales process, and sales training.
So I know you've worn many hats in the automotive space. The really cool part about not only wearing a lot of different hats is you've had experience in different states, right? Not just in one specific location, because I think the thing that people really don't always get is not every dealership is created equal. So, that's really cool to have you on the show today to give that perspective. Plus, I know you're a huge data nerd, just like myself. I know I've said that before. I don't know I can reiterate that enough. I love looking at the numbers and letting that guide me to make decisions. So, without further ado, I want to kind of jump into here. Since you get to look at the data, since you in your current role, you see millions and millions and millions of call information ranging from sales, service, parts, anything that's coming into the dealership. So if you can, share with us a stat or some data, it's some kind of insight that you were able to see kind of coming into this role that, maybe our listeners or somebody that isn't in the data as much as you are would be kind of shocked to hear.
Sure. So I'll tell you, to your point, obviously we see stores of all sizes and all varieties, different personalities. But one thing that's been very consistent across that is the lack of the connected call, right? So it's very staggering when you look at the data and you see that regardless of the rooftop size, regardless of whether they have a receptionist that is taking that call on or an IVR, which is press 1 for sales too, right? They still have a 38% average of
38%.
38%.
So you're telling me 38% of the people that are calling in are not even connected with anybody at the dealership.
So they're not connected with the intended person, right?
Okay, so I call the receptionist. I say, hey, I want to speak to Steven, and they're just not making it.
Correct. They get stuck in an IVR loop where press 1, press 1, press 1, or they're getting to a voicemail box and not making it to that person. So when you think about that and you're thinking about your spends, right? Your digital marketing, your traditional marketing, really any dollars that you're spending, 38% of those are going to waste just because we can't get the call answered.
Wow. That is a huge number when you think about that, because if I'm not getting to my intended party, I'm not starting off on the right foot. I'm already at a disadvantage, even if I get another salesperson, assuming it's a sales call, right? Or service, and any other reason. If I called to speak to you and you don't answer that phone, and I'm assuming that you're going to answer that phone, I'm already starting off on the wrong foot.
And that's if you call back, right?
That's if I call back, yeah.
And we know how tough it is to get back in touch with somebody that is as a callback, right?
Right. So, I know that's for, the whole dealership in general. And a lot of times that we have these discussions, it's very focused on the sales portion of things, right? So we're really driven around sales, but I also want to focus on service. Is that the same number for service? I know it's all the calls that come in, but is it like 30% sales and then 40% service that make up that 38% average? Do you see that same thing on the service side?
So typically speaking, we see a little bit higher in the service side of it. A lot of these customers are getting those, they drop their car off in the morning time and they say, hey, when's my car going to be ready? It'll be ready after lunch. So then 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, what happens?
You get that huge rush. Everybody's calling in to check on their car.
They want to know, is my car ready? Is my car ready? Right? So instead of setting that expectation that we're not sure if your car's going to be ready after lunch. But what we can do is call you back. And in scheduling that call back, that does several things. One is it's going to help out with the customer experience, right? They're going to feel better. They're going to feel handled. And if we call them prior to that time, we've exceeded their expectations in a very small way, but it's something that adds up, right? Secondly, we're going to reduce that stress that's on the service advisors who come back from lunchtime and they've got these new people dropping off cars and the phone's ringing off the hook and customers are getting their calls ignored. And now the customer feels like nobody cares, right? They're not good enough to answer the phone of it. So that's going to help everybody out in that equation.
And service is such a key part that, doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think the biggest thing that impacts sales a lot of times that goes unspoken is the customer service that happens in service department, right? So I buy a car from you, I'm happy, I'm all excited, something goes wrong. Of course, I'm not happy. I'm not happy to be in your dealership again. I don't want to be there to service my car. And it's a great opportunity through warranties and a whole slew of things to really kick things off and make them feel valued. And if you're not doing that by setting clear expectations of, hey, we are a little busy today, but you can expect a call around 3:00 instead of everything at noon. Is that what you're suggesting?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And to your point, we're looking at, in my dealership role, one of the things we looked at in terms of stats is how many times a customer services after they make a vehicle purchase and how that relates to loyalty, right? So what we found is that customers that service with us twice or more after they made a vehicle purchase were exponentially more likely to buy their next car from us. So if we're killing those expectations, if we're hurting that relationship on their first oil change, which
I'm not coming back.
Right. And most of the time we give them away for free because we want to get them in the door and start that process, right? So we give that away and then we hurt the whole thing by not being able to answer their call when they call in.
And just a quick story about that. I had a neighbor who, of course, wanted to go through myself in the dealership world to get a vehicle. Buys the vehicle, gets the free oil changes because there's quite a few dealerships that, still give that out or use that as a way to draw in customers versus another dealership or a why buy, I guess you would say. And they went to go schedule service. And trust me, I heard about this being the neighbor. And they called in and they didn't get a hold of anybody. Went to voicemail. It's like, I just need to schedule service. So they called in again. Still didn't get a hold of anybody. Went to a voicemail. So they went online, figured, hey, maybe I can schedule it online. And they were, if I remember correctly, about 3 weeks out from even getting him in for an oil change. And he's a little bit of a procrastinator. I'm guilty of that myself from time to time. But, the thing is, he's like, I got to get it in now. And what really shocked me is he went down the street to, a Jiffy Lube or a quick lube to get it done and paid for it. All because, we didn't pick up that phone originally. And there's plenty of service managers that you'll talk to. When it comes to somebody's business, there are times that you can schedule and squeeze people in, especially for an oil change.
Absolutely.
When you're looking at something that we set up in the back end for you to go online to try to schedule that appointment for. And I think it's key. And the reason I wanted to tell that story is, again, from the customer standpoint, we've got to really start thinking about them. We can't just do what's convenient for us. If yes, we care about the people that are coming through the service drive and we need to help them and they are top priority over answering that phone, but you can't forget about the phones. Correct. You can't just let them go because it is hurting your business. And if it's anywhere close to what you're saying, which is the cool part, because I know you've shared that with me before, 38%. That's crazy.
Isn't that insane?
It is utterly insane. So,
and the thing is with that, right? So for myself as a dealer, I had a call review actually had come to us and said, hey, we really want you to take a look at this product, blah, blah, blah. It's call tracking software, right? We had other alternatives and things like that. And they said, well, you are probably missing more than 40% of your calls. I don't think that's possible, right? I've got receptionists in there. They're doing warm transfers, right? They're doing all those things right. They're making sure that the other person on the other end is answering that call. There's no way this is happening. So in having a conversation with our platform GM and then also with a couple of our GMs, I asked them, do you think this is viable? Do you think it's possible? Oh, there's no way. I thought so too, right? I was in my own comfort zone. So he said, you know what? Why don't we make some calls right now? Let's just call into the dealership and see what our success rate in getting to sales and getting into service. We did 10 calls. half of them made it to the intended
Oh,
person.
wow.
And we're like, okay, well, maybe there is something to this, right? So we put the tool in place. In our first month, we realized we were at a 48% of loss of connections. That's a red flag, right? That's a huge, huge number of people. And when
You don't know about that unless you inspect it.
you have no way
Or
to know.
something put in place to see that information.
That's correct. Somebody has to make that a priority, right? The phone's not going away. We thought the internet was, but it stuck around, right? So the phones are still typically one of the dealership's best lead sources, right? It's instant. It takes care of the customer's needs. And what we're seeing in a lot of cases is that those lead forms, while those go up and down, those phone calls stay pretty consistent in terms of as a percentage across the dealership sites.
And I don't think anybody would disagree with us here when we tell you this, but phone ups are always going to close higher than your internet leads per se. Right?
Absolutely.
You've got them. They're already engaged. You're speaking to them. But if you can, share with us a little bit of insight on, best time to contact that customer. So we get an inbound call. Of course, we're already engaged with internet leads, with follow up for salespeople back on the sales side. We've got to make outbound calls, and we're definitely busy throughout the day. But if you're strategic about what you do and how you do it, you can definitely get a little bit of an advantage. So I know dating back, there was a study done by the Harvard Business Review, and I think it was back in 2016. And that study really stood out to me because there was an infographic, and I love infographics. Again, this is back to me being a nerd. That really showed something interesting to me, that the best time to get a hold of a customer, and this is back to 2016, the best time to get a hold of a customer on an outbound sales phone call was between 4 and 5 p.m. And the second best time was between 8 and 9 a.m. Now, I know a lot of things have changed from them. Is that something that you're still seeing on the sales side?
So what's interesting is that, if we look at it aggregately, right, across all the stores, we still see, and we're looking at data from a number of different angles, right? We're looking at when they're placing the calls. We're also looking at if they're connecting to a voicemail or reaching a live person. We're looking at time or duration of the call to find out what period of times they're getting the highest duration versus the highest connectivity versus the highest connection to a voicemail, right? And then even if they're leaving those voicemails. So when we're looking at this data and we're trying to determine what is that time of day, right? We see that there's a little shift there. We get it. Our dealers are having a better response when it comes to that lunch hour and just after that 12 to 2 time. And then we also see that when the customers are getting off of work and we're getting beyond that dinner hour, which is not consistent for anybody anymore,
right?
In that 5 to 7, those seem to be the peak times. And again, that's as an overall average. But when you start looking into on a metro level, it completely changes. It completely changes for the customers and you think about it from a end user perspective, right? You've got some areas that are big factory areas that are running 3 shifts, and the majority of that area's employment is to this factory. So that time cycle shifts based on who it is that's contacting them, right? So what we find is that when we look at the time of the lead, that typically the connection rate is within an hour of the time that lead was sent in, which is sometimes difficult if they're third shift workers, right?
Right. Yes. And the big thing, and I've said this before in a speaking engagement, and I love saying this, and what you just mentioned goes right along those lines is, and on this podcast, on anything that you listen to, please understand that national averages or large data set averages are guidelines. They are not expectations, right?
Correct.
So, I couldn't have said it better myself. You're pointing out that not every dealership, just like we said before, is created equal. You've got to look at this data yourself. But on an average, when you look at an average of 38% of the calls not getting answered or the best times to call, those are good guidelines. That's
Absolutely.
a great place to start. And then what you do after that is continue to use the data or have a system in place to be able to see that information. If you can't see it, you're kind of going in blind here, and not everybody can. There's smaller independent lots that have to just use those guidelines and trust that they work. And I understand that, and that's why we wanted to give you that information. But I highly encourage everybody that's out there that if you're going to implement a strategy of calling at specific times, that you at least go into it understanding that you need to go back and revisit those numbers and play with it a little bit and find out what's best for you in your area. Would you agree?
I would. And I think the other thing that we see is that you get a lot of reaction, right? When it comes to when a dealer looks at the phone calls again, right? It becomes a reactive strategy. So they see, okay, man, we suck on the phones. Well, we've always felt that way. You ever want to make a GM nervous? Let's just tell them, hey, let's listen to some of your calls. And you watch them get very
squirm
uncomfortable.
in the chair. Yeah, it's like, oh, I trust you. I trust you. I don't need you to play anything for me here.
Right. And phones become something that we used to talk about. Right. It was a factor of something that we know is important. We know it's part of our business, but it's just difficult. Right. There's pain when we're listening to the calls. There's pain when we're trying to shift that process. So to your point, right, you've got to start somewhere. And starting with those national statistics to find out where your groove is at is huge. But then also having those levels of expectation that you're putting on your team based on connections, not based on quantity of calls, changes the behavior. And that's what it's about. You have to change behavior. Because if what's going on now isn't working for you, that's what you really ultimately have to change.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here smiling. For those of you that are listening on the podcast, we do put these episodes up on YouTube for you to check out and see. And the reason I'm smiling so much is because all of this information is just great for me. I absorb this, and I always try to continue to learn. So this is a great example of what I can do to try to get a hold of a customer. Great outbound times to call and when to do it, knowing that we have to answer the phone. But I've got to ask you, once I pick up that phone, once I actually get to speak to that customer, what are some best practices that you see or that you can share with us that, hey, now I'm engaged. Now I'm talking to you on the phone. What are some things that you recommend saying or some best practices that you have?
Perfect. So I think that part of that is that you have to, it starts before you dial the phone, right? And it's something we've heard in every call training we've ever heard or done, right? You want to make sure that you're in a place that you can make that call that's not going to be disruptive. You want to make sure that you're prepared to make that call, not just prepared to make phone calls, but be prepared to make a call to that individual. You know what's going on with their file. You're not calling in blind and stuttering about what vehicle it is that they've got an interest in, or if you've already talked to them before, or what the message is that you're delivering. And you also got to have a purpose. Just like when you leave a voicemail, if there's an intent and a real message, a real sense of urgency for that call back, you're going to get a response, right? When you're calling and you have that intensity and you have that focus on your phone call and you're connecting to somebody, the rest of it is just magic. It's just you being you, right? You're letting out part of your personality across the phone to it. But being prepared for that call is the first absolute aspect of that. Too many times we hear calls where they're just not prepared for it. And the customer takes control of that call right away, right? They start asking them the questions, or they start shutting down the call because they're not in a mood to deal with a call like that. But if someone's having a relationship with them, or they're adding on to conversation that they've already had previously, or asking them real questions about what their needs are, and they know that they care and are trying to solve a problem for them, they're going to listen to them.
Right, and it's all about building rapport. One of the sales things that always stood out for me, for a salesperson selling a car, is you actually have a higher gross on your repeat customers because they trust you more, right? And that's back to building rapport. And you cannot do that if I'm placing a call out and I, ring, 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 and the call goes out and I say, hello, this is John from ABC Motors. Is this sorry, Eric, hey, is this Eric? And it really does not sound genuine. It does not sound like you're well prepared for that call. Back to your point of take a second, and it's really back to that quality versus quantity, and not just, hey, I can make 100 phone calls versus making 12 or 20 or 15 or whatever, quality phone calls that you take a second, you're well prepared for that. And you see that with internet responses as well, not to get away from phone, but they'll tell you the same thing. With an internet response, you do yourself more damage by sending a quick autoresponder that isn't answering a customer's question, especially when they asked you for one, or discussing exactly what they want you to talk about, just because you want to get a quick response time and something back out to that customer right away. They'd rather you take a moment, talking about email, and make sure that it's a good quality response. And it's the same thing that echoes all the way through with phone calls. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And to your point, I mean, when you're having that first touch and it's a phone call, and you've just got that internet lead that came in, right? And that question is there, just because you don't want to answer the question, right? What's the best possible price on this? How much money do I need to down? What's my vehicle worth, right? What's my monthly payment going to be? Just because you don't want to answer those questions doesn't mean that it still doesn't exist for the consumer, right? You've got to be prepared to answer those questions if asked on it, right? And have a logical response to them, not just hope that it goes away. Because then when they read that email and they see that you still haven't answered them, your chances of reaching them again are almost zero.
You're absolutely right. And the other thing I wanted to bring to light today, Steven and I have had conversations before. He is a person that I really trust to get insight regarding anything with the phones. He is a true expert when it comes to this, and I trust him. And I will tell you, all the advice that you've given me, every bit of our conversation that we have, I've always been shocked. And I've started in disbelief, kind of how you started in disbelief with the whole 38% at the beginning of this podcast and at a vendor pitch that was happening when you were in the dealership world. I was a little bit hesitant about something that you brought up that I want to kind of discuss is, I'm calling from my desk phone. I'm a salesperson. I'm calling from my desk phone. I'm a sales manager, whoever I am, and I call out and I don't get a hold of the customer, right? They send me to voicemail. I don't speak to them. Of how many people are texting back to that number? Is that something you're seeing happen often?
It is. So, and it's funny, we really started seeing that a few years ago, in the dealership space, and we're looking at these stores, and we had some of our stores that just didn't have text-enabled lines. It wasn't something that we had really thought through or really given any consideration to whatsoever. But then we had text-enabled that was just part of some package that we had. And we started realizing, wait a minute, these customers are not calling us back, they're texting us. And they're asking us vital questions. And when we text and tested those lines out ourselves, we didn't get that response back from Verizon or AT&T saying, this is a landline, right? We got no response because as a dealer, we weren't getting those messages. And the consumer, the end user, was not getting that tag back that it was a landline. So now the consumer's mind is, hey, nobody cares. They're ignoring my text here. They must be too busy.
And one of the big things I saw with, something that happened quite often on those texts back is, you're not getting a text back to your phone. That's saying, hey, I'm sorry I couldn't answer the phone, but I want to schedule an appointment at 1:00. Maybe it might happen for you. Kudos if it does, but that's typically not what at least I saw. And, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. A lot of what we saw was, hey, I'm busy. Can you call me back at 1:00? Hey, I'm in a meeting. Can you call me back in 30 minutes? Those are key. Those are key informations to take away to better communicate with your customer. Because let's play through a scenario here. An internet lead comes in. I call it. I text it. I email it. I send it a video. I do all of those things. But on my call, they send me to voicemail. So I don't communicate with you at any point. Now, some people will do second attempts, which we highly recommend, especially on the first day. If anything, please do them on the first day for those second attempts. But even if you're doing a second attempt, you're doing it at a much later time, right? At a time that's convenient for you, that based off of the data that we shared before, you're going to try in between that window that's best suited to try to get a hold of them. But if that's at 4 and 5, and you were supposed to call them at 1, now we're back to that. They just are another number. They're not a true customer to you. You don't care, which is not your intentions, but it's the perception of the customer that you're ruining there. And you've already put yourself in a bad light. Because if I tell you to call me at 1 and you don't call me at 1, it's not a good start.
Correct. And the other thing you got to keep in mind is that most customers aren't reaching out to a single dealer. We wish they were, right? We wish that we were the only dealer that they were reaching out to and cared about. But if they told you and your competitor both to call back at 1 and you don't, but they do, who's going to get that business?
Absolutely.
Right? Customers don't have time when they're in that decision mode, when they're ready to make that vehicle purchase, especially on new, right? Where it's so easy to get that same 2020 Honda Accord. It's so easy for them. They want to get this process over once they made that decision. And they want that process to be easy and transparent and simple. And if we've set up that layer of trust by ignoring their request, we're never going to get the opportunity to earn their business.
You're absolutely right. And that dealer gets to have a conversation, which is so much more powerful than an email or anything that goes out because of the natural inflection in your tone and the rapport that you can build, and just being a normal human being, and they're not talking to a robot or having to go through an IVR for 10 minutes to get hold. Because I know for me, if I'm calling customer service or whoever it is, one of the things that frustrates me the most is I feel like I have to hit 10 numbers to get to the person that I really need to. It's like, okay, press 1 for sales. All right, then I press 1 for sales. Press 1 for new, press 2 for you.
Right.
It's like, oh my gosh, just get me to sales, right?
Exactly.
Does it really? And I understand every dealership is different. Some have different buildings. Some have a new building and a used building, both the same brand on the same lot, and they want to direct that calls, and that's fine. But you got to get that human aspect back in front of that customer, so they feel that they're just not another transaction or another number, but they're actually a customer of yours.
Absolutely. And you mentioned IVRs, and it brought up to my mind something that we came across not that long ago, which was when customers hit that IVR, they are exponentially more likely to navigate it properly if it's voice enabled. So it's interesting. We're looking at the
Really?
data, how many customers are dropping off when they get to that IVR, just simply because we think that they don't want to press 1 or press 2, right? When really what it is they're driving.
I was going to say,
They're going down the road. They can't get to their phone in time, and it's already a pain because they had to manually dial or look up the number on Google while they're at a stoplight. Now they're cruising down the road, and now they got to press 1 or 2. We found out when we enact the voice activated one where they can say or press 1 for sales, say or press 2 for service, that fall off drops off greatly, right? The customers are now engaging more and moving past that line.
I'm so glad you joined me today, because these are perfect examples of key takeaways from this podcast to quickly and easily implement at your dealership. I mean, I didn't even know coming in today that was really even a thing. I know that there's voice responsive IVRs.
Sure.
I've witnessed that before, but for you to sit here and tell me that plays a big role shocks me until you actually discuss it. It's like, yeah, I make all my phone calls in the car for the most part, when I'm driving home, that's not business related.
Sure.
And if I'm buying a car, it's not business related, it's personal, right? I'm buying a car for me, I'm buying a car for my family. So maybe I can't make that call at work. So if I'm doing it, I'm driving home, it's so insightful. And that's why we wanted to create this podcast. This is one of the main reasons is we're going through each communication type. We on our previous podcast had Steve Laureys on, who I have immense amount of respect for, that discussed video and GIFs, as we called it, and texting best practices, and having you on today to discuss all of this stuff around phone. I would be shocked to have anybody not listen to this podcast and at least take away something that they can implement back at their dealership. There's definitely a lot of opinions around what to say or how to say it. Things such as put the customer on hold right away to take control of the call. I feel like I start that conversation and it's one or the other. I get two extremes of, no, don't do that, that's too old school. And then, oh no, that's still a very valid practice that you need to do. And those are opinions to me. And you've got to test to see what works well for you at your dealership and your area with your customers.
Absolutely.
But the things that we can use as guidelines, back to those guidelines, which is when to call a customer, to be prepared when you actually talk to them, and making sure that they're probably going to text you back, right? Make it actionable. Call with a purpose that's the verbiage I was looking for that you mentioned. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to drive all the way out here today, sit down with me and share those insights with everybody. And I think it's great because they get to see you for the expert that I've seen you for quite some time now. We've had wonderful conversations. Yeah. I've been privy to all of this information, and I'm so glad that you shared it today with us. So, Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you as well, John. It's been, as always, it's a pleasure to see you. It's awesome to be able to talk data and to be able to talk, how we can correct behaviors.
Great. And again, thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're at home, at break, or on break, or driving in traffic. We just talked about that. If you're listening to us on your drive home, if there's a topic that you would like us to discuss, please just comment below. I'd be more than happy to talk about it myself, or as I like to do is pull in industry experts, and have that level of insight brought to the table. So if you're listening in, you're walking away with key takeaways and something to actually do at your dealership, not just a whole bunch of fluff, as I would say. So again, please remember to leave that in the comments if you have any topic that you want us to cover, as well as remember to share and subscribe our podcast as we continue to bring these to you. We want to make sure that you are staying with us and you're updated on all the new content that we push out. Thanks so much. And thanks again for listening.